Hello, everyone. I see that we have a few people who are still brave enough not to head to the beach. So welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm actually Pieter-Jan Speelmans. I'm the CTO of THEO Technologies. We develop THEO Player, and we very often get the question, can we do more? Can we simplify things? And can we use progressive web apps, for example, in order to do this? So to get started, maybe, what are progressive web apps? It's actually very, very simple. It's right there in the name. The progressive part basically points to the enhanced capabilities that it has. It basically means you use on that platform whatever is available, and if there's something else that is available, you progressively add new functionality on top of it. The web part is very simple as well. It basically points to that this is something which is built on web technology, using HTML5, using JavaScript, and using CSS. And then, of course, the app part, that kind of speaks for itself as well. It basically points to the fact that you can run this as you can run any native application on a mobile device or potentially even on a desktop device or another connected device. Think smart TVs, who are also starting to support this kind of approach. The next question that I then usually get is, oh, great, so this is an application. Can I use this to simplify my approach around apps? Because I'm developing way too many apps on way too many platforms, and I want to support more platforms, so it's causing me a number of issues. The answer is not very simple. The answer is yes on one side. But on the other side, the answer is also no. It's a little bit more complex than most people would like it to be, but there are a number of pros and cons if you look at progressive web apps. From one standpoint, if you look at progressive web apps, if you do them well, then basically they can behave in exactly the same way as native applications can behave. So that's already a very good tick in the box. Another advantage that they have is they can allow you to simplify your application approach because they work on a lot more platforms than you usually have. Normally, a lot of people, they build a different app for Android, a different one for iOS. They have a lot of different code bases. With progressive web apps, you basically get that nice dreamland where you develop an application once and you can reuse it on all the different platforms. And even better, if you look at it from a media perspective, you can also almost do everything that you would want to do. You can play your live content, your video-on-demand content. It will be rendered in hardware. You can even do DRM with it, even the level 1 style white-fine things running with the hardware DRM that a lot of content owners are requesting these days. And you can even do some more advanced use cases like offline viewing. But that's also where a number of strange asterisks appear because it's not all very, happy sunshine throughout the entire day. There are some limitations which are there, and that basically brings me to the no side of the story. An argument that we hear very often is, well, it's a progressive web app, but it's still JavaScript. It's not the same as if you're running native code. And that's indeed true. You will take a small performance hit if you start doing this, like you have when you are running JavaScript. But then if you look at the alternatives that a lot of other people are using, they want to simplify their app approach as well. And the approach that they take is, well, they look at things like React Native or NativeScript, and they develop their application in JavaScript and then just build it into a native application. Something that not that many people know is that if you actually use a React Native style approach, it's even worse compared to what a progressive web app is, simply because there are, for example, on the iOS platform, some limitations that Apple has built in, which remove the capabilities to do just-in-time compilation, which basically is why JavaScript, the performance hit of JavaScript isn't as big compared to normal native code. But if you do, for example, React Native on iOS, you still have that performance hit, and it's bigger compared to when you do it in progressive web apps. Another thing which is kind of limiting the progressive web app approach today still is that you don't have access to all the sensors which are in your mobile devices. The web APIs have come a very far way. You can do a lot of things. You can access the cameras. You can access a number of sensors like the orientation sensor. But if you want to do, for example, like fingerprint authentication, then you're more or less out of luck for now. Another thing, I don't know if it's really a big negative, but it will be a big negative in some development teams. I'm actually expecting a very big religious war on the fact that it's not really native. It's always a question. One of the approaches is, of course, better, but it's not said that the progressive web app approach is less good than the native approach in every use case. There are actually quite a lot of use cases where running progressive web apps makes a lot of sense. It is the use cases where you don't have the heavy compute tasks. You don't really need the big optimizations that you have in the native code. So then the next question is, of course, should I use progressive web apps? And every time that if you type this in Google, like progressive web apps, what are the advantages? It's always compared to a lot of different things. They always start listing the advantages that you have compared to web. They always start listing the advantages that you have compared to native apps, but they mix them all together and you don't know which one is which. And of course, most people are already doing mobile web, for example, so they have some of those advantages already. A lot of people are doing native apps, so they have some of the advantages of native apps already as well. And then the question is, does it still make sense if I already have both approaches? Why should I have another approach, which is a progressive web app? And in order to do that, you basically need to split it out a little bit. If you compare it to web, for example, if you look at the bottom line, PWAs can do about everything that a native app can do. It can give you that native experience. And I mean, the example I put here is the example of food. It's one of the bigger Indian VOD platforms. And they made some pretty nice statistics that they compared. But the thing that people always forget to mention is that the approach that they had was basically only a mobile web approach. So they didn't have any applications. And if you then look at these numbers, so if you look at, for example, an 80% reduction in page load time, that's very interesting. But if you already have a native app approach, there's no notion of a page. So page load time, of course, can be almost infinitely faster compared to the web approach. If you really look at it, the bottom line is, if you have a PWA and you develop an app, yes, you will have more or less the same advantages as you have when you build a progressive web app. Of course, on the other hand, if you don't have a native app approach yet, then yes, a progressive web app can already make a lot of sense. Simply because that kind of results, you can probably achieve something similar. On the other hand, if you already have the native apps, but you don't have, for example, well, a mobile web style environment, most people probably do, but if you then look at and start comparing those, there's of course the idea behind progressive web apps that they are a lot cheaper to develop, simply because web technology is, well, people think that it's easier because you can port it around across the different platforms. People have the impression that they can shrink their development teams and that they don't need, that they can reallocate the resources that they have to focus on, well, the business essential projects and pivot them away so that they can reallocate the resources better. Then again, there are, as I already mentioned, other approaches how you can do that, like working with React Native or NativeScript, which more or less have the same idea behind it. But even there are companies who are starting to use things like React Native. You still see that they need to train the people that they have to work very well with React Native, because originally they were iOS experts or they were Android experts. And because the paradigm is changing, they need to be retrained as well. And the same thing actually goes if you start looking at progressive web apps. So you have that same problem there. Yes, you can probably reduce cost, but you need to find the right people in order to develop it again, because it's still, yes, it's web, but it's still different from just building a normal website. Some other advantages that you do get, which are quite notable. On one side, of course, progressive web apps are a lot easier to update. You don't have to go through the App Store validation process, so that, well, gives you quite a lot of freedom on that side. And another one, which actually comes up with a lot of customers of ours who are in regions which have, well, let's say, less expensive phones in their market. Progressive web apps almost use no storage to install. And that might seem like, well, a non-important thing. But if you, well, a lot of people used to have it a few years back that if you started installing a lot of apps, that you would run out of storage space on your device. That is still the case for quite a lot of people around the world. Bottom line though, progressive web apps, what do they give you? The cheaper to develop side, the easy to update side, the no storage, well, that's basically the same advantages as you have when you build a decent mobile website. So in the end, the question there is, does it make sense? It makes sense, but it really depends on your use cases and how well your mobile website and your applications that you currently have already are. So let's put that aside for now, and let's look at how you can actually use them if you're building a media application. It still depends a little bit on the use case of how you would go around it. But in general, it's very simple. Step one is you always start with your website. And unless if you've been, well, not updating your website for the last decade, you probably have made your website more user-friendly. It's probably responsive already. You just need to figure out, is it really showing what you want that application that you're going to make? Is your mobile website already showing what you want it to show? Is it already user-friendly enough? Is it already intuitive enough? And can people get access to the content quickly and efficiently as you would want them to have in an app? Usually, for the bulk of the people, step one will actually be already a check in the box, and they can basically move on to a next phase. The next phase is actually a simple one as well. It's writing a JSON file. It's a pretty simple standard, the web manifests, which is basically, let's say, a ledger which you have to create to announce to web browsers, but also to search engines, for example, that the website that they are visiting or crawling at a certain moment in time, that website is actually a progressive web app. And it contains a number of silly things that you need to configure in manifests and applications as well. Think about things like the thumbnail image that you want to show up on the home screen, a title that needs to be there, some other styling information like colors of themes, but also a number of resources which need to be installed on the device itself. Those devices, well, those files which need to install, I'll go into them in the next step. But the most important thing about this manifest in the end is making sure that the application can be identified and that it can be found. Why? It, of course, allows you to replace that pop-up that you probably have on your mobile website at this point to install your app, to basically install a progressive web app, which then, well, simplifies things a little bit. But also, it means that if you search for that app on Google or for your website on Google, that Google will automatically identify that it's a progressive web app and will start showing to the user and, well, first of all, bump you in rank because Google loves progressive web apps, apparently. They will bump you in rank, put you higher in the search results, and they will start showing nice icons like these apps you can install on your mobile device, which makes discovery a lot easier. And then I already mentioned it very briefly, the files which need to be installed. The file that needs to be installed is actually the service worker. And the service worker is more or less, let's say, the core engine of what a progressive web app is. In essence, it's not much more than a simple JavaScript file. It's not really a complex thing, and it basically comes down to a network proxy. What does that mean? It means that every request that your application or your web page will make towards the network, so all the resources that you have on your backend, will go through that service worker. It allows the service worker to basically start caching, and as a result, if you open up your web page, that service worker can see, oh, I have a copy of this asset that you're requesting, for example, the main page or a style sheet or some JavaScript or even poster images that you are trying to load, retrieve them from the cache and return them immediately to the application, which of course reduces loading times in that application and can give like the instant feedback that you're used to getting when you are opening up an app. That's actually the core. And the nicest thing about it is because you can cache all of those assets, you can become network independent. So even when your device is not connected to a network because you're on an airplane or on a train, or simply because you've switched off your data, you can still use that app and you can still use it to do whatever you want. So that's really a nice thing, especially in areas as well where network connectivity isn't a thing that you have all the time, but where it tends to vary. This is really the core of what a progressive web app does. Next to this, you can still start leveraging a number of other capabilities. One that we usually hear about is actually media notifications. It's something that a lot of native apps do as well. It basically allows you to send push notifications to all the users who have installed that progressive web app to notify them of a new show which is starting, which they like, or to allow them to control, for example, the media playback on their device simply through that notification, which might come in even on a different device. It's one of the things that we see pretty often when we see progressive web apps, simply because more and more native apps are starting to do it as well. The really juicy thing, actually, when it comes to progressive web apps, is actually improving the user experience, and improving the user experience quite significantly by using preloading. As most of you probably know, abandonment rates rise significantly when video startup time increases. When you start leveraging preloading, which becomes very easy when you have a service worker to intercept those requests and to start caching, you can actually make sure that if you cache the first few seconds of a video asset, that you can start playback almost immediately. For example, in one of the tests that we did with one of our customers, they had a 4K file, which was running at, I think, like 10 megabit per second. And on a decent network, it would take them like 5, 6, 7 seconds to actually start playback of that asset. When they used preloading with progressive web workers, with progressive web apps, it basically reduced that time to only a few hundred milliseconds. So as a result, a user would simply click to start playing that asset, and it would just start playback immediately. In that time when playback was started, of course, in the background, the app could then load the other files that it would need to continue playback and just give a very, very smooth user experience. This becomes very interesting when you only load it, of course, for the videos which have a high probability of being played, because you don't want to start downloading minutes or even hours of video, which is never going to be consumed after all. But by using a number of intelligent heuristics, for example, the positioning of the icons that people can click on the screen, and well, other indications which show intent, that actually allows you to preload very efficiently to make sure that you're not loading too much data, but still get the benefits of the reduced startup times. Another nice thing that you can do here, I touched upon it very briefly earlier already, is taking that thing to the next level and making sure that you just start caching entire videos or entire assets inside the progressive web app. This allows you, of course, if you're from a user perspective, you can preload a certain asset when you're on your home Wi-Fi because you don't want to use your mobile data or because you will be on a train or on an airplane at a later point in time, and you won't have network connectivity. So that's also a pretty nice thing that you can do there. As I mentioned, there are a number of asterisks there if you start doing DRM. Biggest problem there is actually on iOS. On Android, it's more or less finished. But that's something which is, well, quite important to keep in mind when you are trying to do this kind of things. The most important thing actually here is all of the things which were mentioned, they are not really, well, depending on the progressive web app to really be installed. So if you have your mobile website, by using these kind of technologies, you can also simply enhance the website itself. So when people start accessing your mobile website, they can also benefit from the reduced startup times. They can also benefit even from offline downloading if needed, or you can still send them push notifications if they then accept to allow the push notifications to be sent to them. So it really is an enhancement of the website itself. So even when you're not thinking about it in the way of them being installed as apps, you still get a lot of additional benefits for the people using it on their mobile platform, which of course reduces the gap for them because installing an app for some people still is a mental barrier which they don't really like to cross. So in the end, if you look at it, to come back to the question, should you use progressive web apps? It's definitely something which is worth considering. You're probably doing mobile web at this point anyway, and this for me really is the next step, really the step where the internet is probably going to in the very, very near future. And the nice thing is because the technology has matured over the past few years and because it's available on so many different platforms, you can actually start making advantage of this to reach platforms that otherwise you would not build a native application for. Think about even smart TVs, which are starting to support progressive web apps and, well, these web technologies that I presented here. And as a result, you can potentially avoid to build native applications for more platforms, or depending, of course, on the use cases that you have, you can potentially reduce the implementation load that you have on the native applications that you're already developing. In the end, I mean, the best advice that we can usually give is try to improve your user experience as good as possible. And progressive web apps really allow you to increase that viewer experience quite significantly, which in the end will drive consumption and will make sure that, well, that user engagement increases quite significantly. And that more or less brings me already to the end of my talk. So I see that I've been, well, a little bit faster than I originally anticipated. So I don't know if there's any questions, but feel free to ask. Yeah.
Not so much about directly progressive web apps, but the idea of offline playback.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening in the ad world around supporting offline playback, and what do you do about that?
Yeah, in the ad world is actually, it's actually very interesting, and it's kind of related as well to analytics for offline because they're usually kind of connected. What we see is that for the analytics part on one side, which of course is core for advertisements as well, it's being accepted more and more that those analytics are sent in bulk after the user reconnects. And what we see for the advertisements is that some advertisement providers, but not all of them yet, do allow you to preload certain advertisements on the device as well. Usually the CPM rates are lower if that happens, and they only pay you if you send out the bulk request. well, the analytics bulk request afterwards. So it's not really an area where there's a lot of people who really want to do it, simply because CPM rates are lower and you need to really have a certain level of trust. But I do know of a few use cases where direct ad sales are being monetized offline. Yeah.
Regarding the offline too, with downloading videos, so if you're intentional, like this, we have a use case where we have thousands of videos in low connectivity places, and sometimes you go to a cafe, you want to download the videos and then go to a village or somewhere else to play that. How do PWAs play in that space with downloading intentionally and then discoverability that you can then find it?
Yeah. The way how you, well, make sure that you can download it intentionally is actually very similar to how you do it in a native application. So you will have your catalog somewhere, and what you will need to do in the interface of your website is add a button there to simply download it. That's more or less the same. It doesn't really change in a progressive web app. The nice thing about a progressive web app is that every workflow that you're using in a native application, like, for example, those offline use cases, you can use them in progressive web apps as well. The only thing that you sometimes need to take care of when you think progressive web apps and offline, but you need to think of that as well with native applications, is of course that you can run out of storage space if you start storing, well, a lot of different clips.
PWAs to put a message up saying you don't have enough space?
Yes. The trickier thing there is that you can't always measure how much space you have left. So it's more or less a responsive model. So the PWA, the web interfaces will let you know if you're close to running out of space, and you do have some indication of how much space you have left, but it's not really accurate in most cases. Okay, then I would say thank you everyone for joining, and well, now it's time to enjoy the sun. And I know that like in more or less, I think it's 5:15, there's the other talk still in the Grand Hall, so let's see how many people show up there.